I was told by a relative who would listen to who'd want to read anything you wrote.
Oh,
Well, that's also part and parcel of the kinds of things that writers go through, and
yeah,
as you well know, support from your family, especially uh, close people, isn't always what you hope it would be.
right.
You live with it; it's part and parcel. But then you find that there are other people who absolutely love your writing. Uh, I found that looking at reviews, which I actually went back through and reread the Amazon reviews and some of the Goodreads reviews, just to get a sense of how to answer some of your questions for this list of uh, what things make things work,
Right.
what what do your readers like, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the reality of it is, having read through them, I've got a lot of new ideas about how people have received the book. I've gotten good reviews by and large, just not a lot of them. Uh, yet, I put that yet. I've said many times, books have no expiration date.
Tell everybody, Mike, where you grew up. Where was it that you were born?
I was born in Chicago, and I grew up in New York on Long Island. The town I grew up in was called Garden City, and but I want to address the growing up part, and there's a lot of people that say that that's still in process.
What did your parents do for a living? Was anybody in the arts?
No, not in the ones that we would be discussing. Uh, my dad was a clothing manufacturer. He grew up in a family business, went to war, came home, and from there he and his brothers took over from my grandparents, making children's wear,
Hmm.
and particularly specifically sleepwear. Dad spent some time in the army above the Arctic Circle, where in fact he was testing out equipment right about the time that the Battle of the Bulge was taking place,
Wow.
and they were testing out basically winterized equipment. And he came home with the idea of a sleeping bag for babies, and it became trademarked. It was called a blanket sleeper, and the thing that made it, I guess, most significant was that at the bottom of the sleeping bag there was a little thread you snipped, and it folded out, so you had an additional 6 months for the baby to stay covered completely. So that was something. Uh, and he spent his life selling to department stores specifically.
Wow.
Mom was I when I was young. Mom was a homemaker essentially, but my mother worked with my father on occasion. But her World War II experience was also memorable for her. She was a buyer for department stores. She worked for Lit Brothers in Philadelphia and then Stickdale and Fuller in Philadelphia, in St. Louis. She joined as a vice president a company that made war equipment. Basically, they did webbing for belts, the inside helmet that went under the metal,
Okay, sure.
and she was awarded the Army Navy E Award for excellence, which was a special award given to individuals who were in the war manufacturing business, I guess.
Who would you say was your most influential person in terms of your writing journey then?
The person who most affected me to start, I guess it was more reading than it was writing.
Sure.
But I took a creative writing course when I was in ninth grade. Uh, the teacher's name was Russ Fritz, and he's unfortunately passed because I would have loved to have the opportunity to say, "Hey, look what you did.
Mm.
Here I am now writing books." Uh, but the real impetus of getting started writing was my father's death.
Mm.
Dad passed 10 years ago, and what I had intended to do was to write a little anecdotal history of his life, just to pass around to the family.
Mm.
But when I started researching, I went through his papers and things like that. Uh, I started to realize that there was a lot more to the story than I knew. He left a tremendous amount of primary documents from his military days. He even wrote a short biography or autobiography, which was a nice source document to get a feel for what he did. His story was the basis for my first book. The book is called Reflections on the Generous Generation. Two other things in terms of who were the influencers. First was John Jakes. He wrote a story of the Kent family. It was called the Kent Family Chronicles. I believe there were 9 books, and it went from the revolutionary times to the early 20th century, following essentially a family tree, and it was fascinating. And I remember waiting for 2 years for the last books to come out. He then followed up with North and South, which we saw as a TV docudrama, whatever,
Right.
which was also fun. It was a great read. There were 3 books in that, I believe. North and South was the first one. I don't even remember the names, but I do know that his writing just drove home to me how nice it was to have a good history in a fictional setting.
Mm.
But when I started writing, I think the person that really pushed me over the top in terms of all the storytelling was J.K. Rowling. I love Harry Potter, and I'm sure. Well, I know I'm not like the only person who can say that, but looking at her story, looking at the characters she created, the entire world that she created, was fascinating to me. And although at this point I certainly don't claim to be anyone or anything like that, uh, I can say without any hesitation that that was the driving force for me to actually finish the 6 books in the Quantum Touch series. I hooked up with Amy Davis uh, early on. I said I basically put an ad out. I wrote a book. Now what? And I got answers, and I looked at all the people, and she and I have been working together now through most of my writing, and she has been a teacher, a mentor, and a lot of tough love, because her approach to writing made me a better writer,
Mm.
clearly. And that was hard for her too because I'm stubborn. There's a lot of things I didn't want to change, but just for example, Storm Portal, the first book in the series, it had six beginnings. It was written and rewritten and rewritten, uh, which also has a story behind it. I had given the original manuscript to my nephew, who was at the time 14, and I asked him if he would read it, tell me what he thought. His mother told me he read it in one night.
Huh.
It was a 300-page, 8.5 by 11, double spaced, Times New Roman. You know how it works. And she said he went through it in one night, which was amazing to her because he doesn't read. And the comments that I got back, I think, changed my life. He said I really liked it, but it was that but that just did it, man. He said, I don't like your ending.
Hmm.
Because what I had done is I had anticipated Storm Portal would be a one off.
Wow.
I was trying to say, well, can I write fiction? And he said, if you change the ending so you don't kill off your protagonist, uh, you can keep the story going. Well, okay. That was the point where I said, okay, let's take a look and see how we do this. And so I went back through it, said, okay, how do we rewrite the ending so that it actually ends with possibility going forward? And 6 books later, I finished it.
To me, it's very interesting that you found your niche in fiction later. Were you always like dabbling in writing during that time period? From John Jakes to J.K. Rowling is quite the distance in terms of from reading perspectives. So were you kind of always scribbling? Were you kind of writing short stories? Were you doing anything writing wise before you sat down and wrote the Time Portal series?
The answer to that is yes and no. Real impetus for actually starting to write came from my wife. She
Yeah,
said, you really ought to write something. Now, my wife, Linda, is also an author, which you also know.
yeah.
But she had said to me, you write well. Why don't you do it? Linda basically said, right. I've been scribbling for years. I wrote poetry. I had journals when I was in high school and college. Uh, but I never, ever, ever, that's a lot of evers, uh, thought about being a writer on any kind of a professional basis. It happened, and I enjoyed every minute of it. Uh,
Yeah.
the writing part is the easy part, which I will say to anybody, it's getting the audience built, getting attention, etc., is the hard part, the marketing part. And I've been in sales my entire life, so I understand how hard it can be.
Mm.
I also know that the issue of writer's block is real, not crippling.
Mm.
I found my way through writer's block through 6 books in the series, and both before and after, by writing other things. I play. I mean, for all intents and purposes, I still, although for 10 years I've been doing this, I still consider myself a new writer.
Yeah.
I'm still working my way up through the minors. I haven't made it into the big leagues yet. The thing that I did is I wrote short stories,
Yeah.
and I've seen it said many times that the best way to get through becoming a writer is to keep writing, no matter what. I've seen everything, write 500 words a day. I'm particularly enamored with Andy Miguel's uh, Write Storm, which just absolutely does work. Uh, his whole thing is if you sit down for an hour, you can write 1,000 words, which isn't really a lot,
Right.
but 1,000 words, if you do it every day, that's 365,000 words. And if you figure the average book is 80, 90, 100,000, you got 3 or 4 books there, even if you take out a whole lot of words when you're editing. I know that too because I took 50,000 words out of book 5. Uh, one of those things is well, I was experimenting with the writing part, and they didn't fit to the story and not to the audience, so they came out. 50,000 words is half a book, but they're now on the cutting room floor, if you will.
I think people don't realize that we're not afraid of doing something like that as writers. So that a lot of people would go like, "Wow, that's crazy that would happen." But sometimes things don't work. They don't work, right? So
Absolutely. I mean, I could say this without hesitation. That is, if you keep writing, your writing will improve.
yeah,
You have to, but you can't just do it in a vacuum.
yeah,
I've read a tremendous number of books on how to write. There are some places that you just need to learn how to do things. How do you write good dialogue? How do you write good characters? What makes them stand out to a reader? How do you write description that doesn't get so utterly boring and bog down your story? And that was the whole thing that I learned with my editor. Amy just said, if you get lost in the weeds with description, people are going to skip over it.
yeah,
Was it Elmore Leonard? I guess said uh, writing is like life,
yeah,
except you take out the boring stuff.
yeah.
Uh,
that is Elmore Leonard.
well, and it's true. I mean, I've read I I read a Pulitzer winner a couple of years back that I couldn't get through it.
Yeah,
I was looking at the thing and just saying, when are you going to get to the story? You know, what's going on here? Description, 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 and it just somebody loved it because
yeah,
obviously it won the Pulitzer. But I look at that and say, well, not me, it's just not my cup of tea, or glass of whiskey or anything else that you drink for that matter. I just couldn't get through it. And there are other books that I've seen that have got awards that were fantastic that I couldn't get through. Not every book is for everybody. And that's something that I would certainly tell any writer. Don't worry about trying to make everybody happy. Write what you want, and you'll find readers.
yeah.
And if they're not your family, that's fine too. That's probably better.
Yeah.
The approach that people take to writing is so incredibly different from person to person. And I think it's wonderful. I've said this now for ages. The traditional publishers find what they call marketable books. But if you read for story, like I did, if the story grabs you, it doesn't matter who published it. It's really, really fun to read good stories. And there's so many brilliant ideas that that have been created by indie writers.
Yeah.
Now, I did myself. I was picked up by a publisher uh, of indie books. I guess a year and a half ago, something like that. And I still read a lot of a lot of indie writers' books. I wish I could get to more of them because I look at ideas and I look at characters and I look at storyline and I say, how can people miss this stuff? I mean, from our conversations in the past, that I do in fact review, and I also post the reviews, at least to my favorite place in the world, Facebook, and I let people know. I also obviously post to Amazon, but it's just so important from my standpoint that people get to know who's out there.
Yeah.
The storylines are unbelievable. I mean, the one in particular I'm going to mention, and it's certainly not the only one, but I've read everything that C.L. Schneider has written, and she's created, in my opinion, one of the best literary characters that we've ever seen, which is Dahlia Knight. That's in her current series, who is a shapeshifter. She's part dragon and part and human. But I'm not going to go any further than that. But the story is fabulous. She's just written such a dynamic and I think fascinating character who acts up, and it's actually I was going to call it a cops and robbers book.
Yeah.
And it really is. I mean, the stories are, and it's fascinating. She just created an entire multi-genre approach to literature that's just different. And among many, I would say they're worth reading. I also read a book called Amongst the Killing.
Stop.
There's also a fascinating approach to looking at crime, looking at a murder, looking at murders, I guess, and a psychological view of the killer.
Yeah.
And I thought it was a fabulous book. The guy who wrote his name is Joe Compton. That's you. I forgot.
Thank you, sir. That's nice of you.
There's so many ways that people are looking at books today, and people say, well, there's a formula, blah, blah, blah. Well, there may be a formula for James Patterson or Danielle Steele, and obviously it's put money in their pockets. But realistically, there's so many other stories that are well written, well created, that just never make it to the headlines.
Yeah.
And obviously, in this day and age that we're living, there's a lot of distraction. Let's put it that way.
Right.
So I wonder if people read as much as they used to.
Going back to you, though, I'm curious. At a young age, were you a natural storyteller? Were you someone who really gravitated toward telling stories? And
my parents bought my sister and I hand puppets, and we built a stage and actually had puppet theater for the local neighborhood kids. So yeah, I wrote some stories that were so kind of silly. But again, I have been a storyteller, I guess, in a lot of ways since I was little. I just never thought of it in the sense of professionalism.
Now writing now into a professional setting and being professional about your writing, do you look back at those times and see subtle influences that you take from that writing time or that storytelling time that you've applied to what you're doing now?
Honestly, no. I mean, in the 10 years that I've been doing this, the influences are current. The stories are tied to where I am in my life writing today. I don't see any real tie other than the fact that telling stories is not a new thing for me.
Yeah. This question is a bit more unique to you than most people because you have lived quite a life. And I kind of want to turn this question on its head a little bit because you decided later on to become a writer. you had a different path that you were walking before that. So, did you ever think about veering off of that path at some point and doing this, or was it just at the time, the timing just became perfect to do it where you are as you are right now?
I think the answer is that the opportunity and the availability of time. They had an intersection, as I said earlier, when my dad died, and I haven't looked back.
Hmm.
I'm now into writing what I believe will be my 8th published book,
Yeah.
uh, which is again part of the part of the fun of being a writer is trying different things. I mean, the book I'm writing right now is titled Sarah and the Dragons. Now, another dragon book. Here we go. Well, okay, I'll buy that. That's another dragon book. But the thing to me, from that standpoint, is that the inspiration for that book is To Kill a Mockingbird.
Ah.
Well, there is some things you could probably draw parallels to. It's not. I'm not trying to be a historical novel. It is a dragon story. It's about a little girl who's rescued by dragons. And I'm not going to tell you anything more about it.
All right. Please. That's awesome.
The fun part about it is trying new things.
Yeah, sure.
I've never been a horror writer, but thanks to Michael Elliott, I've read a few things, and I guess basically it comes down to experimentation.
Yeah.
I've written short stories that are just a little different. I have one that is what's called Conversations with the Devil. I have one that's called The Rocker. And I'm hoping that sometime this year, once I finish Sarah, that I'll go back and clean up all the short stories I've done and put them out as a collection.
Awesome.
And then we'll see where we go from there.
That's awesome.
I know that it's no different for any other writer. I've got a million things that I started, a million things that I have. Well, why don't I do this? I've outlined 2 books that are ready to go if I ever sit down to write them. We'll see what happens. But right now, as it stands, the next book is going to come out sometime this year. Hopefully, well, I describe it as a kid's book for adults. I'm looking at the possibility of a coloring book to go along with it. We'll see what happens with that.
Nice.
But again, it's a matter of playing. I mean, it's like a kid's game for me at this
Yeah.
point. What can I do? Where can I go?
Knowing you for the years that I've known you now, always something that struck me about conversations we've had is they were very enriching in terms of, we have intellectual kind of banter back and forth, and so for me, I always feel like dialogue is one of your strong suits, and I'm just curious what the key to dialogue for you is and what intrigues you so much about it.
Well, first of all, I think dialogue fills in all sorts of things. Particularly, it helps with your characters. It's almost entirely about characters. It helps you get around all the business of description. Uh, but to me, dialogue, I've said this before, dialogue for me is reporting.
Hmm.
They say writers hear voices in their heads.
Yeah.
It's true. It's true. The entirety of the Quantum Touch series is listening to my characters as they interact, and then simply writing it down. That sounds ridiculous, I know, but in all honesty, that's the way I wrote it. I could hear them, I could see them. As I was writing, what was going on was the images in my head were them talking to me. So it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
Dialogue was easy. Now, writing good dialogue is hard, and I'm still learning how to do it well. But I think it's because what you're trying to do is differentiate your characters. Whether you have good guys or bad guys or all the secondary characters, what you're trying to do is to say, okay, they don't all sound the same, they don't act the same, they're different, and
Yeah.
it's like people. You want to be able to say things in your dialogue that reflect that.
So when it comes to history, because again, the strong suit of yours is your history background and knowing so much about it and doing so much research about it. We'll get to the research part of it here in a moment. But what is something you have to remind yourself of to be careful, or at least step around lightly, tread lightly when you're playing around with history, because you are kind of manipulating it in a certain extent.
I think you're complimenting it if you do it right. Compliment with an E, not an I, although I is possible also. Uh, History is recorded. Perception is how you interpret it. Point of view matters. The difference between a soldier in the foxhole and the general in the background, or at headquarters, if you will. The perception of war, for instance, is different for both of them.
Yeah.
But both histories are there. The problem with a lot of war biographies and war stories is it focuses on, particularly the true stuff. Uh, it focuses on the people who made the decisions, not the guys who actually were in the trenches. Recorded history is still recorded. It's there.
Right.
And you can't make facts, you can't manipulate facts so that you have a true story. You need to have the real basis. That's your foundation. So if you've got a real story, you have real facts, and that's what makes history so important, to be accurate.
Is it important? Is it important for you to be authentic with what you're writing about? Do you feel like you have to be truthful in some respects?
To the degree that the actual history is going to be talked about, yes. In terms of how you position it.
So, with your research then in digging into these characters, how much of that do you present to your audience, and how much of it do you just hold on to? And do you feel like that all makes you a better writer for doing that?
My historical research, let's deal with that first. I read a lot of books in each of the segments to try to get a feel for the character of the historical figure. I'll give you one example. Professor Alan Gelso from, I believe, Gettysburg College wrote a book called Gettysburg: The Last Invasion, which I recommend to everyone. It's a beautifully written book. It's almost novelish, if you will, but it's a history of 3 days at Gettysburg, and then some of the aftermath. But there was a point where he described one of Robert E. Lee's ticks, where he would take his spectacles, which they called them before we call them glasses. Took his spectacles and he would take the arm and just twist it in his fingers while he was thinking or talking about something seriously. Well, I read this entire book. I loved it, but that's the only thing out of that book that I took. The business of me twisting his. I got that right here. You get the idea.
Yeah.
The need to get perspective is important when you're writing characters, I think. And even if they're little tiny things, the research goes into both creating the story, but it also goes into making you a better writer. How do you pull something that minute out of a 400-page book and use it so that it's effective? There's one of those. Oh, I didn't realize I was doing it. We do have things that are little ticks that we all do. And picking up one little one, I think, fleshes out the character a little bit. It makes the writing a little more interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But the research part of it is also, from a writer standpoint, I think it's important to read about writing, how to write. Not everybody's going to be able to write a book that'll actually give you every tip that you ever would need about how to put a story on page. Uh, but it may teach you how to go back and when you're editing to fix things that need to be fixed, to flesh out things that need to be fleshed out, and to cut things that don't need to be there. So I have used that as much as the historical work uh, to create the characters and the story.
All right, let's talk about your characters. Let's talk about your writing specifically. Let's get into the meat of who you are and what you're writing about now. Uh, who was the first character you created, and how have they shaped every character you've written since then?
I wrote for the Storm Portal book was Fritz Russ. The teacher that I told you about earlier in my ninth grade creative writing class
Uh
his name was Russell Fritz,
huh.
and that was intentional. Uh, he was just a wonderful man, uh, and his fellow teacher was Ashley Gilbert, who's the English teacher, and he was influential to me as a real person, except his name was Gilbert Ashley. And he was a social studies teacher in junior high school. So you go back a long ways to meet them junior high school, so you can see that they left some serious impressions.
Sure. If
But
nothing else, they gave you good names to use.
yeah, that's for sure. Well, for 6 books, Fritz obviously was a major portion of what I did. And how did they shape the writing? They grew as characters, as people. It was a guy who's a high history teacher. You know, he's been doing it for a decade and was bored. And all of a sudden, he opens his classroom door, and the whole world is open to him. The world, all of history is open to him. And how he responds to that is essentially the major portion of the story all the way through it. As each step of the way goes through, the portal becomes, well, the portal is obviously a mystery to start with because they have no idea how it works.
Right.
As the story progresses, the portal becomes more complex because there are more things that they find out about it and what it can do, but it also complicates all of the storyline. By the time I got to book 6, I realized I had created 6 separate plot lines, and I had to close them off because the story I had planned for book 6 to be the last one, and I needed to wrap it up and to try to tie all these loose ends together was a challenge, and I like to think that I met the challenge.
Nice. You kind of answered the next question earlier about and it may not be the answer you were looking to give, but you mentioned that you had given your nephew the first book and basically told you, hey, you need to write a series. Was that the thing that your audience taught you the most, or that you felt like you were just plain wrong about that now you apply to the story, is that there's more to the story?
I think that would have been the way I would answer it. There's the fact that there are more things to the story. Obviously, the description is it's a time travel series.
Right.
It's not really. The time travel was how I got all of the stuff together. That's the foundation. The story is a combination of action adventure, of a mystery, because portal's a mystery in the beginning, but there's also a conspiracy, a political conspiracy going on in the background, uh, which becomes the major part of the story. It's also it's got an international flair, if you will, because you're dealing with an international conspiracy. You're also dealing with current events, current in our day, which I'm going to say I'm clairvoyant. Let's just put it that
All
way.
right.
The focus was the Middle East initially, and the story ends up with using the portal to basically scare the leaders of the free world, as well, of the whole world, scare them silly to fix things.
Nice.
The bottom line.
Well, if it was only that easy, huh?
Oh, imagine.
What characteristics do your protagonist and antagonist always have to have in your mind? What are some of the things you always need them to be?
I think there's two things that go into it. Number one is they have to be real. You have to be able to relate to them as people. Uh, Bad guys are hard to do, but bad guys are also bad guys. So
Yeah.
everybody knows bad guys. How you create them, how you flesh them out, uh, depends obviously on uh, what you're trying to get to. Uh, there are a lot of bad guys out there who masquerade as good guys. They give to charities, they're nice to children, they pet dogs when they're walking along, and then they steal from you blind, and they get away with it because they can. And that's effectively what I tried to do here, is to find a guy who had everything he could possibly want, but he wanted more. That was my bad guy. Fritz is just, uh, he's a teacher who was confronted with an extraordinary discovery, how he and his surrounding characters dealt with it through the entire story is the Joe Sixpack approach, if you will. What do we all face on a daily basis that drives our lives? So when we're confronted with things, do we run or do we fight? Do we analyze? Do we go away scared? Do we sit back and say, "Oh, well, it's not my problem"? All those kind of things, I think, go into developing your characters. But for me, being able to understand how the characters react to the world around them and what needs to go into, I guess I'd call it improving the human condition. That's trying. That's what I'm trying to do, and I'd say that would probably be the basis for my characters.
Knowing that this was initially just going to be a one-off book, and now how you decided to open it up. Did you at that when you decided to open up? Did you know then? Okay, now I'm going to go for 6, or was it at first I'm going to try another one and go and see how far I go, and then when did 6 become part of your thought process, and how did that change the way you wrote the endings of each book, and what you thought about into the next book in your writing process?
Book 2 is called Sandstorm. Book 2 was actually the opening of book 3. But rather than having War and Peace about that thick, I made it into 2 books. And then it was a matter of saying, okay, because it was just too long, it just kept going and going and going. It fit the time frame that I had in mind. What I wanted to do with the story was to go through what amounted to 2 school years. But once I got started on the thing, uh, I just wrote. I mean, I didn't think about it. I just wrote. And then when I started to look at it, then it was clear it needed to be pared down. But rather than just scrapping, I saw two books. So I cut the thing in half, made book two and book three, which was amazing because the book two was like 550 pages. So what I said is, all right, what have we got? What part of this can be set off as a separate book? And essentially what I did is I found a perfect ending point and then had to redo both books for new to get new beginnings, get an ending for the second book, uh, and then figure out where to go from there. But
A daunting task for a new writer, for sure.
yeah, it was. Uh, but but there was clear delineation. When you interviewed Andy, he said he goes to the ending and then figures out what to go from there.
Right.
It takes me a very, very long time to put together a first draft. I start at the beginning, and then I do the opening sequence, however long it may be. It may be 10 pages, it may be 150. Okay, and then I work on the ending because I want to know where the story is going to wind up.
The ending has always been the hardest part for me. And sometimes it takes 3, 4, 5, 6 months of waiting until the ending comes. But I found that once I could see where I was going to take this, and I had the ending. I didn't need to write the ending. I just needed to know what it was going to be. Then it was possible to say, okay, here's the ending. Now let's fill in the rest of it, and then go back and clean up the garbage afterwards. That's where the 50,000 words disappeared from book 5. But the issue of pantsers versus plotters.
Yeah.
I can tell you right up front, I was a pantser. And I think for the most part, I still am.
Yeah.
But as the books grew more complex, it was necessary to say, well, where am I going with this? So rather than plot the whole thing, I laid out some of the ideas that I had. I actually wrote down like an outline, and not the kind of detailed outline that a real plotter would go through, but enough of an outline so that I had a direction.
Was there tropes you tried to avoid on purpose? Were there things you thought about in terms of a time travel book that you wanted to incorporate so that you were standing out as a different type of time travel book?
Well, I guess the answer to that is I wanted it to be a little different for sure.
Mm-hmm.
What I used in that setting was common everyday things. There's no spaceships, there's no wormholes. It's how did the portal open? Well, to try to avoid spoilers, it's common everyday items and a little bit of history. And it did make a difference in terms of how easy it was and how difficult it was to actually open the portal once the characters found out how it actually worked. But the nuances of the things that went on after, as you move into the second, third, and fourth books, and ultimately to the sixth, the nuances of the portal are very slow in being discovered. And that's part and parcel of how the story keeps going. But like I said, my intent in writing this thing was to meet historical characters.
In doing that, what are some of the aspects do you like exploring for them as characters that get them to those points?
I think in writing that, what I've done is I've explored it myself. It's like I went first and came back, Lewis and Clark, if you will.
Yeah. The parent that makes sure it's safe for their child to cross the street, right?
You got it right. That same kind of thing. The thing I think is that goes back to the pantser plotter thing. Pantsing, you can't do that. Plotting, you can. You say, all right, where am I going to go with this, and what's going to happen, and how the character is going to respond to it. If you've got a little bit of an idea, you already know your characters, so then it gets to a point where you say, okay, well, now I think I know where I'm going to take them. In the series, I have all sorts of secondary characters who are, I think, fun to deal with. Number one is Fritz's mother-in-law. She's an absolute stitch. She is funny, and she's a middle-aged woman who's married to a financial genius type person who's about as right-wing as you're going to get. And they, his daughter married this school teacher. You got to be kidding. You could have done so much better than him. And that goes through a handful of the story. But you wouldn't, it's not something you would figure again in a time travel story.
Right. Well, so that being said, do you think that that's the element that shapes your story the most, is the relationships, or is there something else that you find that will shape your story?
No, it's relationships. I think that everything in life is relationships.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter where, what, how, who, etc. How you relate to people and how they relate to you is ultimately what makes the world go round.
I'm also curious because you are a Pantser converted plotter via Pantser going back and forth. Did that change the way you approach your second draft writing? So you go from your first draft, you end your first draft, and you do whatever you do to start the second draft. Did that process evolve for you? Is there something you do differently now, or is it always the same thing that you tackle right off the bat?
Well, now, and that's the key to this thing. The process has evolved. I call it my wasses. I reread first when I'm done. I let it sit for about 20 minutes, and I start right into the first reread of the original draft. I call it my wasses because I write, and I think I write the way most people think, which is passive. Well, there's nothing more boring than passive. When you're writing, you want the words have to be active. You want to be along. So I go through literally, and I'll put in the find. I will put was. And start counting how many suckers there are in there. And then you go and literally go from one sentence to the next. Say, was this, was that, was it? How do you rewrite this so that you change it from a passive tense to an active sentence, where it fits, where it doesn't fit. Sometimes, I have invariably knocked out 50% of my was's first time through. I also have a list of words that I invariably go through that are tell words, not show. Things like he knew, he thought, etc., which they do the same thing.
Yeah.
And you need to say, all right, he thought or he knew. How does the reader know he knew without knowing he knew? And you go back and you battle with words.
Yeah.
Until you find the word you want, or the phrase you want, or the way to turn the sentence around to make it better. I live with the thesaurus. It's open. Whenever I'm editing, the thesaurus is open. Can I find a better word than this? The English language has 60,000 words or something like that. And most people use about 10% of them.
Yeah.
And You don't need to write. In fact, you shouldn't write using big words. So I was told. But you could use interesting words.
Yeah.
We used a lot of them. And that's what I do is I go through looking for a way to show a scene or a conversation that makes it more interesting to me. Now, if it's more interesting to me, theoretically, I kind of hope it'll be more interesting to the reader,
Right.
but you never know.
And I'm kind of curious about the names of the stories and how Storm became a part of your nomenclature with this series.
Let's start off with Storm Portal, which was the first in the series. The original title was Remembering Mr. Russell. Remembering Mr. Russell. Okay. I'm going to give credit where it's due. Linda came up with it. And she came up with the other one too, Storm Portal. And after that, once we had Storm, we had the Storm in there. Sandstorm was the second book. And so once we had the Storms in there, it seemed logical to carry it all the way through.
Sure.
I had different covers than I do now. My publisher decided that they were going to make it seem like the same cover with different colors.
Right.
To
Smart.
With the branding it.
Right.
Which I can understand. But it was my wife that put that together. The other thing is character names. Where do you get them? Like you said, the teachers were easy. The other stuff came out of all sorts of things. Just almost like a phone book. You say, well, who's the next one down on the list? My student characters, in many cases, are relatives' names, and obviously the historical figures of themselves. Winston Churchill played himself. You see the thing on the movie, Winston Churchill as himself, right?
That being said, what does every Michael R. Stern book or story have to have in it?
I wrote down the answer to that question earlier. I think it has to have a little soul.
Awesome.
No, I don't think that. I know it has to have a little soul, whether it's a short story or whether it's a novel, or even if it's nonfiction. When you write nonfiction, there's still soul that has to go into how you flesh out whatever you're writing. And it's got to be a little of yours, and it's got to be a little of your characters. It has to relate to the human condition. What are the things that drive people to do the things that they do? What things do they love? What things do they hate? What makes them tick as people? And it's not as easy to do as people might think, but that's because we're talking about using words. It's easy to say this and that and the other thing, like the human condition. It's easy to say that. What does that really mean? And that's when a writer has to really look closely at the words that are selected, the words that are used to create the characters, the story, the description, and the heart that makes everyone want to read your books. Tough to do, and worth every minute of trying to do it.